Oh, my fair North Star, I have held to you dearly. I had asked for you to steer me till one cloud scattered night. I got lost in my travels. I met Leo the lion, met a king and met a giant with their errant light. There's the wind and the rain and the mercy of the fallen, who say they have no claim to know what's right. There's the weak and the strong and the bad that have no answer, and that's where I may rest my head tonight. I saw all the bright people in imposing flags. They landed and they got what they demanded, and they scratched at the ground, then they flew, and the field grew as sweetly for the flightless who had longing, yet despite this they could hear every sound. There's the wind and the rain and the mercy of the fallen, who say they have no claim to know what's right. And if your sister or your brother were stumbling on their last mile in a self-inflicted exile, you'd wish for them a humble friend. And I hope someday that the best of false staff's planners give me 7 half-built manners, where half dreams may dream without end. There's the wind and the rain and the mercy of the fallen, who say, hey, it's not my place to know what's right. There's the weak and the strong and the many stars that guide us. We have some of them inside us.
Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Utica. I'm Carol Gable, member of the board. Whether you're visiting for the first time or have been a member for many years, you are welcome here. Whatever faith you have known, if any, you are welcome here. Whoever you are and whomever you love, you are welcome here. We are invited to bring our whole selves to this worship service, our doubts as well as our convictions. The pain and joy we have known, our longing for connection and understanding, every part of you is welcome here. Our congregation acknowledges that the land on which UUUtica is situated is the ancestral lands of the Oneida Nation, one of the original nations of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois people. If you're visiting us today for the first time, only online, we are glad you have joined us. We would love to learn more about you and connect you with our newsletter if you like. There will be a link in the chat to a form that you could complete if you'd like to obtain the newsletter or be contacted. A dedicated group of members have been working on developing a church covenant to guide how we strive to be in relationship with each other to create a beloved community. They will be hosting future coffee hour breakout groups to discuss the covenant and answer questions. But for today, they have presented a video, or we will show you in a minute, on the proposed covenant. Before we play it, I just want to express my deep, heartfelt gratitude to Jerry Reed, Tammy Tenowitz, Jack Pendrak, John Camilleri, and Lori Staubitz for all of their excellent work these past several months. Thank you.
This covenant will be for us a guide, as well as a promise, speaking to our highest aspirations on how we wish to interact and engage with one another as a faith community. The process began prior to the COVID-19 pandemic and re-energized earlier this year as Reverend Laurie Staubitz and the Covenant team began soliciting input from the congregation, and will conclude with an adoption vote in mid-February. The team, composed of Reverend Staubitz, Tammy Tenerowitz, Jack Pendrak, John Camilleri, and Jerry Reed, after input from the congregation, have developed the following for your review. The proposed Unitarian Universalist Church of Utica Covenant. We build our church on a foundation of love and covenant with one another to create a welcoming and trusting, safe community for all. To be open, honest, and compassionate to all, and look for the good intentions of others. Avoid gossip and speak directly to one another to resolve any differences. To speak kindly, respectfully, and compassionately, while listening carefully to all viewpoints. Explore and accept personal responsibility in conflict, being able to forgive and accept forgiveness. Participating with our community where there is common ground, serving with compassion and commitment. Approaching visitors with respect, open hearts and minds, embracing everyone. We commit to this covenant as a means of supporting and living the 8 principles.
Good morning. Our call to worship this morning comes from the Dr. Reverend Cynthia Landrum. Spirit of life and love, we gather today in different ways. From computer screens, from telephones, from car radios, we gather reaching out across the wires, waving from a safe distance, to come together in religious community. From living room to front porch to car seat, we gather as we are able, ready to be of service to each other, to the world, ready to build the community of hope and of love. As we face this bright morning, we are apart, but we are also together, offering our love, our commitment, our hope, and our prayers in service to one another in this world. It is a new way, but an old way, that we come today in worship. Now join us for hymn 1003, Where Do We Come From?
Our chalice lighting is written by Amy Williams Clark, and it is titled, "In This Time of Uncertainty." We gather in this time of uncertainty, full of unknowns, as angst closes in upon us. We light this chalice with a flame that draws us together. With this flame, we cut through the darkness of isolation and are warmed by the fires of our interconnection. For this moment, this radical moment, we find a certainty within the knowledgeable bonds of love and community.
Good morning. Our reading this morning comes from the novel The Plague by Albert Camus. The evil in the world comes almost always from ignorance, and goodwill can cause as much damage as ill will if it is not enlightened. People are more often good than bad, though in fact that is not the question. But they are more or less ignorant, and this is what one calls vice or virtue, the most appalling vice being the ignorance that thinks it knows everything, and which consequently authorizes itself to kill. The murderer's soul is blind, and there is no true goodness or fine love without the greatest possible degree of clear-sightedness. Good morning. The first line of my talk also comes from Camus, so we needed a little bit of a break there. Camus also in The Plague wrote, "There have been as many plagues as wars in history, yet always plagues and wars take people equally by surprise." Camus is right. Plagues, today we call them pandemics, have been part of human history since we walked upright. Viruses and bacteria are tens of thousands of years old. We are just the latest prey. Our history and even our genetics have been shaped by our cultural and biological responses to pathogens. And yet for nearly all of human history, we have been baffled when disease strikes and by what causes it. Before we had microscopes and genetic sequencing, we attributed plagues like the weather to a god or gods who were either punishing us or teaching us, or perhaps both. And then for centuries, the reigning theory was that disease was caused by miasma, a stench in the air, first proposed by Hippocrates. That at least is closer to the truth than divine retribution. Filth breeds both foul odors and disease. Malaria, one of mankind's greatest scourges to this day, is Latin for bad air. In his book on the COVID-19 pandemic, Apollo's Arrow, scientist Nicholas Christakis noted that each generation learns anew that pandemics are as old as society, but still unexpected. While the way we have come to live in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic might feel alien and unnatural, Christakis writes, it is actually neither of these things. Plagues are a feature of the human species. What happened in 2020 was not new to our species. It was just new to us. As a science writer for PostStandard and Syracuse.com, I've been covering the COVID-19 pandemic since it began. I've interviewed infectious disease doctors and virologists and epidemiologists. I've talked to people who suffered from COVID, a man who 6 months after recovering still had fatigue and shortness of breath, the mother of an 18-year-old who loved video games and died of the virus, to dozens and dozens of people who've told me their stories about their illness. When normal people were riding out the pandemic shutdown a couple years ago by binging on Netflix or reading escapist novels, I doubled down on pandemics. Since then, I've probably read 25 books or so on infectious disease, epidemics, and pandemics. Bubonic plague, cholera, malaria, influenza, AIDS, Ebola, yellow fever, smallpox, SARS, and of course, COVID-19. I have quite a reading list if you're interested. I spliced in a few pandemic novels too, including The Plague. If you haven't read it since college, which I hadn't, I highly recommend it. Both is a work of great literature and an insight into how humans deal with terror and uncertainty of death whenever it comes. I engrossed myself in the history of pandemics because I wanted to understand the current one. I wanted to know how diseases work, how they spread, how they mutate, how our immune systems respond. And I wanted to know how humans work when faced with those diseases, how our brains and societies respond. And I found some common themes. There is always great and unequal suffering. There's always a scapegoat. There's always resistance to public health measures. there's always denial. And there's always an end eventually. And there's always hope. I'd like to talk today about the lessons I've learned, and I think that pandemics can teach us if we're willing to listen, which we often are not. I'll start by saying that we are much, much better prepared to handle pandemics than we were even 100 years ago, let alone at the time of the Black Death in the 1300s. Our knowledge of disease and treatments and public health measures has given us so many more tools to fight pandemics with if we use them. I'd like to recap some of the lessons pandemics have taught us and a few that we continue to resist. These are incomplete and perfect lists, and I take responsibility for all omissions. First, the lessons we've learned about diseases and pandemics. Lesson 1, what causes them? In her excellent 2016 book, Pandemic, Sonia Shah traces our long and convoluted history with pandemics. In the past, she wrote, the forces that drove pandemics were obscure to their victims. Today, as we stand on the cusp of the next pandemic, the multi-stage journey from harmless microbe to pandemic-causing pathogen is no longer invisible. Each stage can be laid bare for all to see. It warms my Unitarian Universalist heart to read of scientists pursuing their free and responsible search for truth and meaning, trying to uncover the biological, not theological, foundations of disease, and often facing great opposition in their quest and their findings. From Leeuwenhoek's invention of the microscope in the 1700s that allowed us to look our pathogens directly in the eye, to the filtering and staining methods that allowed us to detect virus and bacteria from the lungs of flu victims in 1918, to the sequencing techniques that allowed us to know the genetic fingerprints of the novel coronavirus within weeks. We know what germs are and we know what they do. We also know how they spread. The plague by a bacterium carried in fleas, by vectors like mosquitoes, which transmit malaria and yellow fever, and most difficult to control, as we've seen, by air, like the novel coronavirus we're dealing with now. Lesson 2, we've learned about pandemics, how to fight them. In the 1840s, an Austrian doctor, Ignaz Semmelweis, noticed that 5 times more women died from deathbed fever at a hospital where doctors delivered babies also performed autopsies. He theorized that doctors were transferring something on their hands from corpses to the delivery room and ordered his staff to clean their hands with soap and chlorine. Deaths plummeted. We didn't know then exactly what was causing it, but we knew how to stop it. And today we know that washing our hands is one of the best ways to prevent the spread of disease. In the cholera epidemic of 1854 in London, a local doctor named John Snow, no, not that John Snow, walked from house to house asking people from which pump they got their water. He drew a crude map that pointed clearly to one thing. People sickened with cholera got their water from the Broad Street pump. Snow finally convinced the city to shut off the pump, ending the epidemic. As far back as 400 BC, we knew that those who suffered from smallpox were immune from getting it again. In the late 1700s, English doctor Edward Jenner heard that milkmaids often got cowpox, a relatively mild infection, but then never got smallpox. He took a piece of a lesion from a maid who had cowpox and inoculated an 8-year-old boy. This was before institutional review boards talked about the ethics of experiments. The boy survived, didn't get smallpox. And it was one of the crucial steps to developing a smallpox vaccine and a jumping off point for the other vaccines that save countless lives today. The Latin word for cow, by the way, is vacca. Lesson 3, it takes a village to control a pandemic. It takes a whole world, actually. Jenner's work ultimately led to one of the greatest achievements of humankind, the eradication of smallpox in 1979. It's hard for us today to fathom the toll of smallpox. It killed up to 500 million people in the 20th century alone. Except for a handful of laboratory samples, smallpox is gone from the earth. How did we do it? By a global network of scientists developing vaccines, by national governments putting up funds, by countless tireless nurses injecting vaccines into arms. In his book, Extra Life, Stephen Johnson credits vaccines as one of the 3 main reasons behind the doubling of human life expectancy since the late 1800s. The others, by the way, are sanitation systems and artificial fertilizer. Vaccines are not developed, tested, produced, and distributed by individuals, but by large systems of thousands of people working for the common good. And so today we have national and global health systems that fight malaria and tuberculosis and novel coronaviruses. Is it enough? No. As we see today, 2 years into a pandemic, 1 million people still die of tuberculosis every year, and malaria remains a way of life in much of Africa. But we have come a long way. And now for the lessons that we have been taught again and again, and yet have yet to learn. Lesson 1, pandemics are no one's fault. With every pandemic, we find a scapegoat. Very often it was divine retribution, but more often, the danger was closer to home. The Great Plague was blamed on Jews poisoning wells, and many Jews were forced into houses and then set aflame. In the 1834 outbreak of cholera in Madrid, 14 priests were murdered, again on suspicion of poisoning wells. Immigrants to the US from Eastern Europe were held responsible for cholera outbreaks in the 1800s. In 1892, New York City Mayor Hugh Grant wrote to President Benjamin Harrison, quote, "Prevent further immigration to this country until all fear of the introduction of cholera shall have disappeared." AIDS was blamed on gay men, on Haitians, on Africans in general. When the first SARS broke out in Hong Kong in 2003 and reached North America, people of Asian descent were shunned on the subway in Tokyo, in Toronto. And when COVID-19 reached our shores in early 2020, via Europe, as it turned out later, our president blamed it on the Chinese. And like the first SARS, Asian Americans faced harassment in the streets. Lesson 2, we've yet to learn. Inequality kills. We are on Zoom today because we live in an unequal world where the richest among us can sign up online for a third COVID shot, while most of the world awaits their first. The Omicron variant now tearing through may have originated in Africa, where vaccination rates are low, or it might have incubated in a single immunocompromised person whose immune system couldn't get rid of it. That means the virus spends more time in lungs and airways, giving it more opportunity to mutate. The rich have always found ways to evade pandemics in ways the poor could not. During the waves of bubonic plague in Europe, the rich would pack up and move to their country manors to wait the dying down of the epidemic. Sometimes the fleas that transmitted the plague stowed along, and they simply spread the disease farther. But mostly it helps to be rich. An estimated 25% of aristocrats and the wealthy in England died during the Great Plague, while 40 to 70% of the peasantry did. And so it is today. A study of US counties showed that for every 1% difference in inequality, there was a 3% increase in COVID deaths. And the third and final lesson we still haven't quite learned. We are all in this together. We've been putting that phrase on lawn signs since March 2020, and we've been saying we support essential workers. But a quick perusal of social media shows that we are, as a nation, still deeply fractured over the pandemic, among other things. Our schools remain battlegrounds, with teachers, parents, and administrators fighting over how to safely keep children in classrooms. During a smallpox outbreak almost 200 years ago, the Massachusetts Sanitary Commission urged people to be vaccinated with these words: "No family, no person liveth to himself alone. Every person has a direct or indirect interest in every other person." Back then, people refused to be vaccinated against smallpox. During the Great Flu pandemic of 1918, which killed a greater share of the world's population than COVID-19 has so far, the Anti-Masking League of San Francisco protested a city ordinance to wear masks. As Unitarian Universalists, we support the right of conscience. It's incumbent upon us to express our views and to listen to those of others, the masked and the unmasked, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, the sick and the healthy. And it's also incumbent upon all of us to do whatever we can as individuals to control the pandemic. Yes, We need large public health systems, and we need to adequately fund them, an unlearned lesson I haven't delved into today. But each of us also needs to have a collective ethos. We do have a direct or indirect interest in every other person. We could make them sick. They can make us sick. Either of us could make someone we don't know sick. And for all the vitriol we've seen over the past 2 years, we have also seen tremendous courage and compassion. Healthcare workers especially, who have been on high alert for 2 exhausting years, continue to care for the sick. So do overworked and underpaid nursing home staff. And there have been other countless smaller hidden acts of compassion, delivering groceries or homemade meals to neighbors in quarantine, lining up at urgent care centers to make sure we were negative before visiting grandma on Thanksgiving, rolling up our sleeves to protect not just ourselves, but others. Compassion in the face of infectious disease has fortunately always been with us. John Kelly's The Great Mortality, An Intimate History of the Black Death, draws on diaries and accounts of those who aided and gave care in the face of death. He noted that the mortality rate of priests in England during the Great Plague was 40%, but most continued serving, administering last rites. And when one priest died, another stepped in. Last year, I interviewed a Syracuse nurse who had volunteered to care for patients at a hospital in New York City in the early days of the pandemic. She contracted COVID-19, spent 12 days in the ICU, and nearly died. A year later, she struggled to climb the stairs of her new house. But she went back to work as a traveling nurse, pulling 12-hour shifts, caring for COVID patients. Which brings us full circle to Camus, an existentialist with a rosy view of humanity's possibilities. Again, from the plague. What we learn in time of pestilence, that there are more things to admire in men than to despise. Thank you. And now join us in singing hymn number 1060 as we sing of hope.
As we sing of hope and joy today, some lonely anguish and despair, how can we lift our voices in this way, while some have pain and misery to spare? If a crumbling world we would renew, we must sing no ordinary song. Peals from a noisy gong will never do. In every breath compassion must be long. Let this song our greatest hopes contain, laughter of a well-fed child, its tune grooves over every heartbeat, its refrain, its harmony from peaceful cities hewn. Sing of joy while hammering each nail. Sing of hope while pulling every weed. So shall we sing together and prevail. May every hallelujah bear a seed.
We have a short meditation and prayer today from the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Ann Parker. Even when our hearts are broken by our own failure or the failure of others cutting into our lives, even when we have done all we can and life is still broken, there is universal love that has never broken faith with us and never will. Now's the time for our offering. If it's one pandemic lesson I think we have all learned is how important our church community is to us, whether online or in person. Now is the time to support that community through our offering, which will be gratefully received. You can donate through a link in the chat.
Now we will extinguish our chalice. Please join in with the words on your screen. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we meet again.
We close with our benediction, titled Benediction for People in Pandemic, by Anya Samuel Michael. When faced with a challenge such as this, we can turn toward one another or we can turn against. We can ignore the cries of our neighbors, or we can let them cry into the arms of our witness. We can respond with indifference to systemic injustice, or we can commit to its undoing. Good souls, tales will be told of how we responded when this particular hell was visited upon our earth. Let us know and let it be said by generations to come that when the pain of our separation was revealed, we moved closer to the promised land of our beloved community. Amen.
Sunday morning, I heard the preacher say, "Thou shalt not kill." I don't wanna hear nothing else about killing, and that it's God's will. Our children are watching us. They put their trust in us. They're gonna be like us. So let's learn from our history and do it differently. I hope for more love, more joy and laughter. I hope we'll have more than you'll ever need. I hope we'll have more happy ever after. I hope we can all live more fearlessly, and we can lose all children are watching us. They put their trust in us. They're gonna be like us. It's okay for us to disagree. We can work it out lovingly. I hope for more love, more joy and laughter. I hope you'll have more than you'll ever need. I hope you'll have more happy ever after. I hope you can all live more fearlessly, and you can lose all your pain and misery. I hope there must be a way to change what's going on. No, I don't have all the answers. I hope for more love, more joy and laughter. I hope you'll have more than you'll ever need. I hope you'll have more happy ever after. I hope we can all live more fearlessly, and you can lose all your pain and misery. I hope